I'm Nik Forrest, an artist and researcher based in Tio'tia, Montreal, an island recognized as unceded indigenous land and the traditional territory of the Ganyankehage. This island has long served as a meeting place for many indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabe. As a white European settler and a non-binary transmasculine person, and as an artist working with sound, I'm thinking about how to listen and work here as a guest with sensitivity and awareness toward the traditions and histories of the indigenous peoples associated with this area, and with recognition of the ongoing presence and vital knowledges of indigenous activists, scholars, and artists, especially around ecological questions and the rich long-term understanding of entangled kinship relations with the more than human. My thinking about materiality, non-human agency, and animacy, and the inseparability and co-emerging human and non-human bodies and environments has been affected and informed by indigenous scholars like Zoe Todd, who points out that crediting white European and settler theorists with inventing the idea of non-human or more than human sentience and agency, and presenting this as a completely new and original insight, erases traditional indigenous knowledge systems as well as contemporary indigenous scholarship. Or Kim Tallbear, another indigenous scholar, who explains the ways that indigenous knowledge and kinship systems include the non-human as sentient relations, and always have, as well as avoiding the binary oppositions of Western epistemologies like nature, culture, or human-animal, and the hierarchical and extractive attitudes that follow from those epistemologies. In relation to sound and listening in particular, Dylan Robinson's book, Hungry Listening, has influenced my thinking about the colonial structures of perception and strategies for unsettling those structures. For example, his concept of shifting layers of listening positionality and an active coming into awareness of the unmarked colonial frameworks and education systems that shape all of our sensory perceptions, as well as the potential of multi-sensory extended approaches to listening for unsettling normative biases and habits, and thinking about listening with uncertainty and as something that could include affective and non-semantic approaches to sound. My PhD work combines sound studies, gender studies, and studio art practice centered on sound installation, performance, and shared listening. And I'm exploring ways that these practices can make palpable and perceptible environments and bodies as entangled, co-emergent, forming and unforming materialities. Through the work and the research, I'm asking how can co-creation and listening with the non-human heighten attunement to our surroundings and to the other humans and non-humans in it? And how can sound and listening work to reorient social and ecological relations? Sound's animate, relational, indeterminate, and emergent characteristics as a non-human force that challenges normative boundaries between nature and culture, technology and biology, and form and formlessness make it, I think, a medium and practice especially well suited to rethinking and reimagining questions of non-conforming embodiment and subjectivation. As sound artist and geographer A.M. Kangizer proposes, Sound is not just about hearing and responding or communicating. It's about becoming aware of registers that are unfamiliar, inaccessible, and maybe even monstrous, and about listening very carefully to the imperceptible. In parallel with the indigenous thinkers cited earlier, I'm interested in perspectives on materiality proposed by interdisciplinary scholars like Mel Chen, or feminist, physicist, new materialist Karen Barad. For Chen, the concept of animacy, or the fragile division between animate and inanimate, that's relentlessly produced and policed, has crucial biopolitical consequences. Inequitable power relations among humans, non-human others, and matter of all kinds are at stake in the hierarchical divisions that undergird traditional Western perspectives. As Chen articulates, for those bodies considered wrong, like trans, non-binary, differently abled, and racialized bodies, rethinking the animacy of all materiality, including the material body itself in relation to its social and environmental surroundings, has urgent political ramifications. For me, once the body is reanimated and can be understood as a dynamic form emerging in a field of social, environmental, material relations, then the way that binary sex and gender have been naturalized can no longer be just taken as common sense. And I'm interested in exploring some of these relations through sound, reimagined as an animate material force that continues to act and change in, with, and through bodies and environments, gathering and carrying traces of its contacts. For Karen Barad, matter itself is an emerging process. Quote, "There's no fixed essence or substance simply there for measuring." And to me, this suggests that what may seem solid, fixed, or fully knowable, like a body, object, or sound itself, is in fact always in process. One way of exploring these ideas that I've been following is through sound derived from very low frequency signals. VLF, or very low frequency carrier waves, are similar to FM radio signals, but they just oscillate at a much lower frequency, so between 3 and 30 kilohertz. And to hear these sounds derived from these signals, you need an antenna receiver that gathers and filters the signal, plus an amplifier and, speakers or headphones. The sound derived from these emissions is interesting to me, both for its aesthetic qualities, the tone, texture, and rhythmic patterns, but also for its conceptually disruptive potential, confounding boundaries between natural, technological, audible, inaudible, and human, non-human. It also challenges ordinary perceptions of time and space, since some VLF signals, which are electromagnetic pulses that interact with the magnetic envelope surrounding the Earth, some of these signals are generated by weather and atmospheric occurrences like lightning or solar flares, solar winds, or aurora borealis. And these are events, that might be happening very nearby to where the signal is picked up, or on the other side of the globe, or in outer space. So for me, listening and working with VLF signals, which are sometimes called natural radio, is partly a way to attune to the normally imperceptible and unfamiliar registers of non-human cosmic and atmospheric transmissions. So a kind of non-human media. In addition to these sources, VLF signals are also generated by the urban electrical grids, power lines, transformers, architectural wiring, and array of electronic and digital devices. As cities and their infrastructures become more dense, and as climate changes and weather events intensify, VLF signals are also affected. So listening with VLF is also a way to attune to these social and environmental changes. In my sound performances, I'm using pre-recorded VLF samples and regular audio mixed with live VLF signals as a kind of human, technical, environmental assemblage that co-composes the sound through listening and working with the signals, but also listening with the room, the equipment, and the other bodies present in a kind of responsive dance of agency, to use Andrew Pickering's formulation. The presence and proximity of bodies in any listening environment, and specifically near VLF antennas, modifies the sound we hear. So these performances can also be understood as a way of listening to entangled bodies, atmosphere, bodies and weather, bodies and technology, or bodies and environments. Speculatively, different bodies will affect sound differently, and specifically they'll affect the VLF signals differently in proximity or in contact with the antenna. And this seems to be what happens when different people are there. Thinking about the effect of entangled bodies, materials, architecture, technology, and sound as transperception, both in the sense that sound artist and thinker Douglas Kahn proposes, where sound gathers and carries traces of its vibrational contact with materials, spaces, and bodies. Or as he puts it, sounds can be heard as having acquired their character through the course of their propagation. We can perceive in sound the influence of objects, artifacts, modulation and media, as well as time and distance. So by listening, we can sense more than simply the origin or communicative or semantic meaning of a particular sound. Kahn's transperception is about sounds intrinsically relational, vibratory, transitional, mutable, and entangled characteristics. I'm also thinking about transperception in terms of the kind of sensing otherwise or sensing beyond usual or apparent limits, as proposed by trans theorist Kyle Keegan, who suggests that sensing something that others miss is in fact part of trans survival and trans becoming. Poet and trans theorist Eva Hayward also describes the radical alterations to bodily sensoriums that are part of medical transitioning. So through my technical human, non-human VLF sensing assemblage, audience participants are invited to listen otherwise, to sense more than is usually apparent, and to attune differently to each other, to the surroundings, and to the media ecology they are part of. The idea of media ecologies has been described in communications and media studies by John Durham Peters, among others. He suggests that we think of media as infrastructures and forms of life, or infrastructures of being, and as the habitats and materials through which we act and are. Understood in these terms, the body, for Peters, is also a media ecology or network. This notion of the body as media network is also taken up by trans theorist Paul Preciado, who points out that at the beginning of the 20th century, with the identification of hormones by researchers Starling and Bayliss, the embodied subject is reimagined as, quote, a hormonal, electrochemical, media-related, and ultra-connected subject. So for Preciado, the hormonal body can be thought of as a system of biocommunication, following the way that hormones act across distance, being produced in one part of the body but affecting change in other parts, so acting as carriers of chemical messages. This action at a distance echoes electromagnetic VLF signals carrying sound across vast as well as minute distances, and also echoes the way that sound has material and social effects, connecting but also trembling what it comes into contact with. In Eva Hayward's piece, Spider Woman, she poetically explores the way that trans bodies emerge in relation to social, architectural, chemical, and material environments. Hayward uses the term transposition, meaning to change something's form or to transfer something from one context to another, to link transitions rearranging and reorienting potentials with place and location. The sensing differently that comes with transitions, radical alterations, are resonant with the extended listening with VLF signals that I'm working with. And I'm trying to think of them both as forms of trans-perception that extend and alter perceptual reach and exceed normative limits. I'm also thinking of how this resonates with Kyle Keegan's suggestion that transness marks the capacity to transform one reality into another and necessitates a ceaseless navigation between the tangible and intangible, perception and sense, and between the real and the imaginary. For Keegan, Hayward, and for me, transition gathers and rearranges the material, physical, sensual, and social self in relation to the surroundings, and always reaches towards more than what is or what is apparent, but reaches and kind of senses towards what could be. Hayward suggests that transition can be thought of as the constitution of a relational milieu, an in-between site through which conductivities and energies form bodiliness, through limits of expressiveness or responsiveness, an arrangement between the sensorial milieu of the self and the profusion of the world. In Hayward's writing, transness poetically emerges as a vibratory and resonant improvised co-composition between the body, the social, the technical, and the environmental, and as a kind of creative sensory engagement in and with surroundings, and as an intensification of materiality and sensation to resonate otherwise. And following this, I'm asking, how do our encounters with sound and with each other, through listening and with our surroundings, reshape, transform, and transfigure us? And how can we think about sound and listening as socially and politically unsettling, enlivening, vibratory, animating, and rearranging forces that can decompose existing orders, or tremble the shape of things as they are, suggesting possibilities for what else could be?